Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Getting Child Safeguarding Right. Ko Josh Margetts tōku ingoa, and I'll be your host for the evening. I'd like to start with our karakia. This karakia is about bringing us together and settling us into a shared kaupapa or purpose for this evening. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tau wai te mauri tū, kia tau wai te mauri ora, tūtura whakamaua, kia teina, teina, haumie, huie, tai kie. I'd really like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Welcome to our New Zealand audience and welcome to anyone dialing in from overseas. I'm really excited for tonight's session, and I'm sure you'll all get a lot from our two guest speakers, Ruth Browning and Joe Hitchcock. This webinar is part of a series that we are running this year to support Balance is Better, Sport NZ's philosophy for youth sport. Hopefully many of you have heard about Balance is Better, but for those that haven't, it's really an evidence-based philosophy to support quality sport experiences for all young people, regardless of ability, needs, and motivations. It's all about young people staying involved in sport for life and realizing their potential at the right time. We all play a role here, whether we're coaches, parents, or particularly important for tonight's kōrero, community, sport leaders, and administrators. Before I introduce our first guest and get into the conversation, there are a couple of housekeeping things to mention. We will be running some live polls tonight, so please watch out for these when they pop up in the chat function. It'd be great to have you interacting with them throughout. If you have any questions as well, please pop them in the chat. If you haven't found that, it's on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll do our best to monitor this throughout and answer as many of the great questions that come through. Like I said at the start, and if you haven't already, pop your name in the chat function and where you're from dialing into from the country. If you do have any technical issues, please just close the window and come back in on the same link. If the issue carries on, contact Hamish, who's working on the background. He'll be using the same email address that you receive the invite link on. And it is important to note that we will not be going into specific issues that relate to child protection in sport other than what is presented. Nor can we answer questions relating to specific scenarios that you or your organisation may be experiencing around child protection. This can be a really sensitive subject, and if you need to seek support or guidance, we'll post a link to the support services in the chat. So let's get into tonight's conversation, Getting Child Safeguarding Right. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first guest this evening. Ruth Browning has been in social work for over 21 years, working with children, youth, and their families in both non-government and government organisations. Ruth has a master's in social research and a postgraduate diploma in social and community work. Ruth's current role is a consultant at Safeguarding Children, where she and the team regularly present webinars and face-to-face trainings on the prevention of abuse within organisations and effective responses where abuse may be happening. I certainly won't be able to do justice to the knowledge and experience that Ruth has in this area. The work from Ruth and the Safeguarding Children team has been hugely influential in the development and direction Sport NZ is taking in child safeguarding and protection. So, Ruth, welcome. I'll hand over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the mahi that you and the team do before we delve into the conversation tonight.
Well, kia ora, Josh. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I hope I do it justice. And kia ora koutou to everybody on the webinar. It's great to see so many people here. So, ko Ruth Browning, tōku ingoa. I am originally from England, but I've worked in New Zealand for 15 years now in this field of child protection and safeguarding. And the current charity that I work for, Safeguarding Children, have worked alongside Sport New Zealand to create a lot of the resources that are going to be shared with you tonight. So our organisation works from a safeguarding perspective, helping organisations put in place what they need to keep children safe, but also to recognise when children need a response to harm that may be happening to them. And they are two terms that we're going to go into shortly. So without further ado, we can move into our presentation.
Kia ora.
So The difference between child protection and safeguarding are two terms that I've already used. So child safeguarding, we refer to as the process that organisations can put in place, the steps that all organisations can put in place that are a proactive approach. So instead of waiting for something to happen and then responding, or thinking that there might be something happening and then responding, these are the steps that we put into place to protect all children. So it's about prevention. So we put in safeguards, and safeguards can be a number of different things that we can put into place. And they prevent harm to all children, not just children that we've identified as being at risk. And then we've got child protection. And child protection is a part of safeguarding. So it doesn't stand alone. It's a part of a safeguarding approach. So to have a child safe organisation, you need to have the safeguards in place that protect all children. But a part of that approach is that you also, your staff know and your volunteers know how to react when a certain child or children are identified as suffering or likely to suffer from harm. So child protection is reactive. We're reacting to risk when we see that or a likelihood that there's risk. And safeguarding is what we do to protect and prevent risk happening. So I believe we've got a poll happening around the difference between these two.
Yeah, so just on that, you can tell I haven't done a webinar in a while, but I was supposed to put this poll in prior to that definition explanation. Thanks for that, Ruth. But Hamish, if you could chuck at the poll in the chat function, which really is just asking the question to everyone on the webinar tonight, whether you know the difference between these two terms, safeguarding and child protection.
And it's not a test.
Cool.
So, or we could see it as that because I've just given you some of those answers. So we might see some of that coming through. But it's common that people don't know the difference between the two terms because they are terms that are used, and they're together. They're used together. So they don't stand alone. They're part of an approach. And actually, to be a child safe organisation, you need both. So you need the proactive approach, putting those steps in place and putting those systems in place to protect all children. And a part of that is that people know how to react when there is something to react to. So hopefully you all understand the difference between those two terms now. They are used regularly throughout the resources that you will be pointed to. And it's important that you understand the differences. So hopefully we can see that you've grasped those two concepts.
It's a really, really great place to start, Ruth. I see about 75% of people are pretty confident in terms of that definition. So, yeah,
Great.
Hopefully as we go through, we can bring that number up a little bit by the end of this.
Awesome. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today as well is the safeguarding steps that organisations can put in place, and they do hold a number of different tools. So it's not just one thing that your organisation needs to do. And commonly we hear people talking about police vets or police checks for safer staff, or having a child protection policy, and that therefore you've done what you need to have a child safe organisation. But actually what we know from creating organisations that are truly child safe is that you need all of these different things in place. You need a number of different things in place. And these you could look at like your skeleton, like your framework that you then hang your processes on. So these are the basics that you need in place. And one of the most important things about these things is that they're not cookie cutters. You don't copy someone else's policy and apply it to your club or organisation, because actually a child protection policy from a rugby club is going to be very different to a child protection policy for a gymnastics club. So although you're in sports, you need to make sure that your policies and your codes of conduct and your recruitment processes are right for your context, that they're actually created for your clubs. So I'm just going to break this diagram down a little bit and talk about each wedge. So the top wedge that you can see up there is safer recruitment. And like I said, we hear a lot of people talking about we do police vets and we do safer recruitment checks. So that's what that part is. That's about making sure that the people that you bring into your organisation or club are safe enough, are appropriate and suitable to be working with children and young people. So the role of a sports coach or a sports person working with children and young people is a position of trust. That's what we call that position. It's a position of trust, because parents are essentially handing their child or young person over to you for a period of time for their sport activity, and they're trusting that you're going to behave appropriately around them. So we need those safer recruitment practices, which in New Zealand are legislated by the Children's Act 2014. So if you receive any government funding, direct or indirect, it's a legislative requirement that you do safer recruitment checks of workers that you employ to be with children and young people. At Safeguarding Children, what we advocate for is that you go beyond the legislative requirement of the Children's Act, and that even if you don't receive government funding, you're an organisation with people in a position of trust. So you do those same checks for all of your employed people and your volunteers. So that would be the gold standard of safer recruitment, would be police checking and doing the safety checks for employed staff and volunteers, whether you're government funded or not. The other part of safer recruitment is people think it is just a police vet, but actually it's down to the organisation to do a risk assessment. That's what it is. It's a risk assessment of that person's suitability to work with children in a position of trust. So it's actually police checks, an interview, getting to know that person, doing a reference check, and asking the right questions in those reference checks of a past employer or a past coach, a past sporting organisation. Questions like, did you ever have any concerns about that person being around children? Those sorts of questions tell us about that person's suitability to work with children. So that top wedge, safer recruitment, really important. And what that provides is that first line going in, a safe workforce with our children and young people. Next wedge along, your child protection policy. Again, really important document. It lays out your organisation's commitment to protecting and safeguarding children. And it tells people in your organisation what to do when they have a concern about a child or young person. So again, legislation requires government funded organisations, certain organisations, to have a child protection policy. So you actually need to go to the legislation and check whether you're one of those organisations that needs to have a child protection policy. But again, go beyond the legislative requirements, and all places that are putting people into positions of trust and working with children should be having a child protection policy. That would be your gold standard. So the policy will also tell people how to record concerns, and it will guide people through processes of what to do. Really important that it's a living document. It's not in a dusty filing cabinet somewhere. It's actually used and known by the people who use it. So we've got a poll up about I think we've got the poll going. Have we got the poll going about the policy, the child protection policy?
Yeah, so Hamish will just make that live now around whether you know if your sports organisation that you're involved with has a child protection policy. So
cool. So we'll, as we see those answers coming in, answer the poll, and we'll be able to talk to that as we go on. So your policy needs to be known by all of the staff. There's no point having a policy that people don't know, because that guides them in how to respond. So making sure that your youngest coaches, through your most junior coaches, through to your CEO, know your child protection policy and what it says. And what that provides is safe ways of working, because people know how to respond and how to safeguard. And then the next wedge round, this green wedge, is a safeguarding code of conduct. And again, a really important piece of paperwork, a document for your club to have in place. We know safer recruitment is a way of keeping people who want to harm children out of your organisation. However, not all people have been convicted. Not all people will come through in a safer recruitment check as unsuitable. So what a code of conduct does is provide a safeguard for the people who are in your organisation. It tells people what is appropriate and not appropriate behaviour around children and young people in your organisation, in the work that you do with children. So it guides people. It makes your behavioural expectations explicit. It says, this is how we do spotting in gymnastics. This is how we ask a child or young person if they want physical touch in a demonstration. And then what that means is when people step outside of the code of conduct with low-level breaches or inappropriate behaviour, some of that may be due to naivety or not knowing. That's guided. People are told what to do and what not to do. You can't expect people to know. There is no such thing as common sense in safeguarding. You need to be explicit. But also what that does is when someone is intentionally breaching because they may be engaging in grooming behaviour or some other inappropriate behaviour with children, it stands out and you can pull it back into line. And if they don't, if the behaviour continues, that gives you an HR process to go through because it gives a document, a guiding document to fall back to that someone wasn't adhering to the code of conduct.
Ruth, just a comment on that. It's in terms of the child protection policy and the code of conduct. Interestingly, we had around 65% say that the organisation does have a child protection policy, 12% think that they don't have a policy, and 22% are unsure. So what would be the message for those people that are either unsure or know that their organisation doesn't have one?
Yeah. So for those that are unsure, after this, use the fire in your belly after this webinar, because we know that, motivation dwindles. So use your motivation after this webinar to go back to your organisation and ask them if they do have one or try and find it. So yeah, find your policy and acquaint yourself with it. If you know that they don't have a policy, look into whether you legally should have one and then go to your superior, the person above you, and let them know that you actually need one. And if it's not required by legislation, but you feel that you should have one, you should go to them and say, hey, I've been to this webinar, I've learned about child protection policies, I can guide you to where we can go for assistance to write a good policy and encourage your organisation to get one in place.
And I think that's the really good time now if we post the file, Hamish, to the links both to the Sport New Zealand website, where there are a range of policies and procedures that any community or regional or national sports organisation, active rec organisation can access templated policies and procedures that can be adapted to the needs of that organisation. It can be quite intimidating to delve into this space, right, Ruth? So having those resources there that can easily be tailored to the needs of the organisation are really, really helpful. So check out the files there in the webinar takeaways for those of you that want to access more resources relating to those policies and procedures.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we've worked really hard with Sport New Zealand to get those templates there, to make that easy for you. Because writing a child protection policy from scratch is intimidating. What needs to go in it? How do we make sure it covers all bases? So that's exactly why those templates are there available to you to make it easy. So on that link that you can follow that to the Sport New Zealand Integrity page, to those templates and resources, it's all there waiting for you. Really today is about explaining to you why you need to have them and the importance of them, because what happens if you don't have a policy is when something does happen, people don't know how to respond. And then people go into sort of crisis mode and you get different responses depending on different experiences and knowledge. And what you need is a consistent approach, which is guided by your policy. So, yeah. I believe there's also codes of conduct templates on that page as well. So it's all there waiting for you to go in and take that. And that's not using cookie cutter. That is actually there for sports organisations. You just need to tailor it for your specific context, for your specific sport. So the code of conduct is there to guide behaviour and to highlight when people are stepping outside of what would be appropriate behaviour. And what that creates is, again, safe ways of working. Also, your child protection policy assists in managing allegation concerns. So if someone does decide actually someone is behaving inappropriately within the club, then your child protection policy tells your organisational staff and volunteers what they need to do with that, where do they go and who do they talk to. So your policy tells people what to do. So it means that when there is harm identified, it's managed and people know what to do. The next triangle around is safeguarding training. So again, you can access this through a link that's going to be shared with you. One of the links is to our website page, Safeguarding Children, and it will take you to a page that is all about child safe organisations with several links to different trainings. And there's also the Sport New Zealand integrity page link, which is shared with you with a free e-learning on the basics of child protection. It's really important that everyone in your organisation has some level of safeguarding and child protection training, because you can't expect people to put in place policies and codes of conduct. They won't get behind them if they don't understand the reasons why. And actually, it's just a matter of doing that basic level of training for people to understand, I know why this policy and why this code of conduct is in place, and I get behind it because I can see the reasons why. So that training is really important. And then that final part of the wedge is inclusivity. And that means that all of these parts of the wedge apply to everybody, about no matter disability, race, religion. We apply these. We make sure all of our members, our club members, are included and are covered by these processes. So just checking off if there's anything from those polls.
Yeah, one question that's come through that it might be good to speak to is coming from Merv. And if their policy is half or fully done, is the answer still no to that poll? What constitutes a good policy?
Well, I would say no, because unless you've got a fully written policy, your members, your club members and your volunteers aren't essentially guided in what to do. And if there was something that they needed to respond to, they can't go to a half-written policy. So I would say, no, you haven't got a policy. And the sooner you can get onto that Sports New Zealand integrity page and get those templates downloaded and check what you've got against those templates, and add in anything that you can see is missing, and complete your policy, the better. So what all of these parts of the pie equal is a safeguarding culture. So you can't have anyone alone. You need to start building on having all of them. And in those two places, our website and the Sport New Zealand website is everything you need to build all of these pieces of that pie.
Ruth, that's great. Thanks so much for that. One thing about this diagram that really jumps out at me is the child-centered practice that is in the center of this whole thing. Do you want to speak a little bit around what that means?
Sure. So child-centered practice means that the reason for all of this is that children are in the middle. So we have these pieces of the pie to create the safe ways of working, to create a safe workforce, to create a child-safe culture, to manage allegations and concerns, so that our focus is with children in the center of what we do. Awesome.
Thanks so much for that. I see we've posted some of those links in the chat function that you'll be able to access, and they're also in a file document that is in there as well. So I'd really encourage everyone to go and have a look through that integrity portal, access all of the policies and procedures that are free and downloadable for your organization. And that's a really good starting point to figure out what you may want to explore in terms of your safeguarding approach. Ruth, thank you so much for sharing tonight. We'll go back at the end and summarize some of the key points. But for now, I'd like us to move on to our second guest speaker. This is Joe Hitchcock. Welcome, Joe. Joe has been the Chief Executive at Badminton New Zealand for the last 8 years. Joe was the winner of the New Zealand Sport and Recreation Awards Future Leader Scholarship, and has recently partnered with Barfoot and Thompson to win the 2021 Commercial Partnership Award. He's been heavily involved in advocacy through roles in New Zealand and Canadian sports systems, and has a great track record of leading change in the sports sector. has a master's in sport management from Massey University. And I went to Massey as well, Joe, so I know how prestigious that university is. Joe's been incredible at being available and open with the mahi that Badminton NZ has been doing in the safeguarding space, and it is great to have Joe support yet another important kaupapa. Welcome, Joe. The floor is all yours to tell us a little bit about yourself and the mahi that Badminton NZ have been embarking on.
Kia ora, Josh, and thanks very much for having me. Kia ora tātou, ko Taranaki te manga, ko tūtaukuri te awa no Ingua aho, ko Hitchcock toku whānau, ko Joe toku whenua. Really a privilege to be here tonight, and thanks for tuning in. And really what I would say is I'm not an expert in this space, but certainly like a lot of people that work and operate in the sports sector and system, we're really well-intentioned individuals that are just trying to do our very best for young Kiwis who are playing and enjoying and loving sport. And look, I really want to be as open and honest as I can be around our journey through sport integrity. And it has been incredibly rocky road, and I think if you are really honest in any sport organisation, you'll find that there are a tremendous amount of ups and downs through this process. So, Josh, if you can flick over to that first slide, I'll talk a little bit about how difficult things have potentially been for us in the past. And again, to me, the first critical part around addressing any kind of problem is to be open and honest around what that problem looks like so you can define it. And inside sport organisations, we operate in a really complex environment and context. And within that, there's a huge amount going on. So I won't read through that terrible list of things that have happened in my 8 years at Badminton New Zealand. And I think if you think about badminton as a sport, we've got an amazing community. It's a fantastic sport. You wouldn't think that a lot of these pieces or components are happening. And I think it's important for us to share our story, because if it's happening in badminton, then it's certainly going to be happening in every sport. So if you don't think you've got child protection or child safeguarding or sport integrity issues within your sport, then you really need to take a closer look at your community and understand what's happening a little bit more in that space would be my advice. And I think it's important to share this also because it's around identifying those issues and seeing where they come from. So Josh, if you just want to flick through to that next slide. So I think for any organisation, it's more about solutions rather than problems. And certainly from our point of view, what we wanted to do was to be as proactive as possible and putting things ahead of the curve and trying to be as proactive and encouraging for education and an opportunity to be better for our community. So when we think about child safeguarding, child protection, we also look at that in a framework of sport integrity, and that includes some other components for any sport organisation, and ours are participant and community wellbeing, drug-free and anti-doping, and anti-corruption. And certainly what we found was we're pretty well resourced, and we were pretty well in tune with our policy and practice in terms of drug-free and anti-doping for a national sport organisation that's been around for a long time. So you've got a level of comfort of how that rolls through. And the other three components have been a work in progress and a learning piece for us. And certainly just want to say that we haven't got all of those components right by any stretch of the imagination, but we really want to do our best in them, and we're eager to continue to improve and work on them and identify and understand and partner with other organisations that can help us in that space. So I think this framework also really reinforces that organisations, whether you're a school or a club or a regional sport organisation or a national sport organisation, you've got a large continuum of work. You've got a real stretch across your resource. And certainly for badminton, we're a small organisation. So these are big things to try tackle and work through. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't. And I think there's some really practical ways that you can go in and about that. Josh, do you just want to go through? So when we looked at child safeguarding, to be honest, it's a really scary space. And that fear can be quite paralyzing because you don't want to make it worse. You don't want to do something wrong. And I think there's often a misconception that if you do something wrong, then it's going to make it 100 times worse than not doing anything at all. And that's been a real barrier that we've seen ourselves, but it's also been a barrier for those that we've worked with in our community to support and work through that process. So a big part of it is just figuring out how to eat the elephant, and you do that by taking one bite at a time. And the core piece that we've found to be really meaningful is just to try and break it down into really manageable chunks so that we can understand it, and then we can interpret it for our coaches, our players, our administrators, our regional associations, our clubs, and so forth. And the best way that we tried to do that was to think of it in these three subgroups. And it's really a simplification of what Ruth was discussing. And I think this is really basic, and it's important to understand those cultural elements that go around communication and a child-centered approach as well. But really, for us, it's about having a really good policy, a strong policy, again, a living document that you actually understand and is going to be helpful when you need to use it. And I think Ruth made a really good point around copy and paste. The natural inclination is to just find something off the web and do the old copy and paste or replace word piece. And what I would say is looking online, there's some fantastic examples and you can learn from those. And then if you incorporate the templates that Sport New Zealand have put together, it's actually really important to do some thinking and have some discussion around it. So in our experience, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of valuable resource and support that will help you get there, but you still need to do some critical thinking to make it specific to what your sport or what your organisation or the children that you're working with connect with. And the second part is around practice. So again, what we don't want to do is set a policy and then just stick it in a file and never think about it again. The practice piece is actually really important to bringing the policy to life and working through your systems and what you do on a weekly, monthly, annual, biannual basis to ensure that the things that you say that you're going to do in your policy, you actually do in real life. And again, sport's a busy place. There's lots of things going on, and it's really easy for things to fall by the wayside if you can't find a coach, or you don't have enough players, or you can't get enough money to go on a trip. Some of those pieces are really easy to fall away, and that's why by having a really simple practice plan, which is what we've called it, which is just a glorified list of all the things, activities that we do that involve children, and then we work through to make sure that as we're going through each of those things, whether they're a regular piece or a standalone event or a competition, that we're just double checking, we can go through and make sure that we're fulfilling our child safeguarding policies.
Joe, that's a great point, and I think it relates to a really good question that's come up in the chat from Danica. She's asked, regarding safeguarding training for coaches, how do we balance the right or required amount of safeguarding training versus making it too onerous that people won't want to become coaches or have any level of training?
Yeah, well, that's $1 million question right there. And I know that, the conversation is, we already ask so much of our coaches. Can you ask them to do another half day? Can you ask them to do another 2 hours? And we have that same conversation with staff and paid development officers within organisations. But the key piece is it's got to be a priority. And I think you have to turn around and say, how do you make that as positive an experience for those individuals as you can? And sometimes it's thinking outside the box in terms of ways that you can recognise and reward them for doing those pieces. And in the end, it's a necessity of delivering a professional and high quality experience for kids. And in the end, you don't want to get to the state where you wish you could have done more and you hadn't.
Yeah, great. Carry on.
Cool. And then the last one really is around response. So if it all does fall to pieces, and in my experience, it's going to fall to pieces at some point. You need to have an understanding of what your policy and your practice is, but you also need to understand who do you talk to, where do you go, and what are the steps that you take to make sure that you are doing everything possible to put the child in the safest environment, to deal with it in a really thorough and professional way. Not only to safeguard them and their experience, but also to safeguard yourself and your organisation, your staff, your volunteers. It's a really critical piece, and it's amazing how not having that forethought and putting down some documents around those pieces can really negatively impact in that space. So responding is a really important part that you need, in our mind, to really script out and have a good understanding of.
Joe, just an observation here. How did this approach for Badminton NZ differ from what you were trying to do internally as Badminton New Zealand, and then how you were supporting the regional and local network?
So I think we've had a very evolution of our thinking in this space. So at the start, we were guilty of saying, well, we've got everything in place. We've got our policy, our practice, our response set for our national programs, our national events. And we only look after a very small part of the community. So that's relatively easy for us. It would be easier then to say, well, job done, all good. But that's not the case in sport. So certainly over the last couple of years, what we've really made a strong piece around is saying we have to be better than that, and we have to make sure that we're lifting up our partner organisations, our regional associations, our members, and the clubs below them. And that's really, really difficult, because the further away they are from us in terms of our connection and our communication, the harder it is to get those messages through and that level of support as well. But those are the really critical organisations, because they're the ones on the ground that are working with players and coaches and the community every day. And that's a much longer and bigger piece, but it's still a critical piece. And you have to front up and put the structures in place to be able to work towards that. And we're nowhere near where we want to be, but we know that we're taking a step every month, every couple of months towards getting better in that space, supporting our regions and making sure that sport integrity piece sort of flows through.
And Joe, on those, the regional associations, and I guess even then the local clubs that within the wider umbrella of Badminton NZ, what has been a common theme that's come out of those conversations that they're sort of considering as a really high priority or the biggest need when it comes to these conversations? Is anything coming out that's a general theme?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been really pleasing is that people want to be good in the space. People want to learn more, and they want to understand how they operate effectively in child safeguarding. So a common theme is definitely a motivation, but connected to that is a lack of understanding of how to tangibly get there. And that's where interpreting pieces is really, really important, and making it practical and as simple as we possibly can, because there's that massive stretch. People are really busy. This is an added piece across a whole range of different things that they need to do. And I think there's a huge sense of relief once they understand the depth of resources that are out there, and they see those pieces on the Sport New Zealand website, and they can navigate through those pretty quickly and easily, and they see that they don't have to create some big scary behemoth. They can actually connect, tie in to what's already been created, make it their own, link it to their national body, and hopefully start delivering better in this space.
Awesome. Should I go to the next slide for you, Joe?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Cool.
So this is what it looks like when the rubber hits the road for us. So this is a part of a document that we have put together around child safeguarding, obviously, and again trying to take some of the stigma or fear factor away from what it actually looks like. So what we say to our regional network is, look, at a base level, we're talking about 4 documents. We're talking about 4 pieces that can make a really important difference to your organisation and keep children safer. Now, that's a child safeguarding policy. That's your code of conduct. That's your absolute fundamental of your triangle. Then we talked about the practice plan and what that looks like, and then obviously the response resources. And so there's a couple of tables like this that we provide through to our partners, and all the way through, what's really important for us is to share examples from Sport New Zealand. So this is what it looks like coming from a super fancy government agency with lots of smart people. The Badminton New Zealand, this is what it looks like from a small NSO that's trying to do the best with a limited amount of resource, and association examples. So what does Badminton Waikato have? What does Hutt Valley Badminton have? And those have been really, really meaningful as well, because that gives a real life view of what's happening, and you get a better understanding of the size and scope of those organisations, because they're often quite big, or they're quite small, or they've got different geographic pieces. But it gives them a really good understanding of where they're at with their pieces. And then we just have basically just a list of additional things that they can think about once they get that base layer set and sorted. And then the final box really is we just try and really reinforce again to all our members and partners that Badminton New Zealand is not an integrity expert, and that's why it's so important to have people like Ruth and her organisation that you can connect with, and you can understand more, and you can get the training that you need in those spaces. And if things do get really concerning, really scary, the New Zealand Police, Oranga Tamariki, and Sport New Zealand, there's a laundry list of support mechanisms within the New Zealand context that you can connect in with.
That's awesome. And one thing that did jump out at me as well when we're talking about answering the balancing act around appropriate training versus extra requirements on community coaches, the online training that is on the Sport NZ website will take around an hour to an hour and a half, and you can log in and back into, it'll keep your progress there. And it's a really good starting point for anyone that's going to be working in active recreational sport, to really get a feel for the important things that go in regards to child safeguarding and protection. So it's a free course, and it's accessible through that link as well. So I'd really encourage everyone to go and jump on there. Ruth, I might just invite you back on as well, just to, along with Joe, just to summarize some of the key points, I guess. And Joe, I think the first one is there for you.
Excellent. So yeah, it's as simple as it says. Starting is the most important thing. So again, you've got a laundry list of things that you're trying to achieve in sport, but this is absolutely number one, I think, in terms of making sure that you're providing a really positive experience for young people. I know as a parent, and I know as somebody that's worked in sport, that it's the one thing that keeps me up at night, is making sure that our kids are as safe as they possibly can be. So I know for us in our organisation and the people that we work with, we want to make a start. We want to make sure that we're operating in that space. And like I said at the start, it's really easy to be intimidated, but you don't need to be. If you start thinking, and the best things that we've had is really open conversations around what's relevant, what's not relevant, what's over the top, what's common sense, what does it look like for us that's going to actually be practical and meaningful for our participants and for our community.
And
Yeah.
Ruth, over to you.
Yeah, I'd support everything that Joe has just said. It really is just about making a start, and it can be intimidating. This space is, it's concerning when things happen. It's concerning when we're worried about things happening, and when you haven't done this work before in terms of putting those things in place and thinking about your responses. It can be really scary to think about. What we know is that once you do start thinking about it and you do some of the training and you access the resources that are available to you, it is step by step. And, we've supported a lot of different organisations through the layers of the most junior members right up to the CEOs, and everyone can do this. Everyone can play their part. And I'm going to whip to the third point, that it is a collective responsibility, that it's don't be intimidated. It's not one person that can put all of this in place for an organisation. It's like Joe said, it's about having those conversations. All of the resources that have been shared with you tonight will guide you. There's lots of templates that you can take and use, but also have conversations within your clubs about what does that look like when we put that into place. What extras do we need for our code of conduct to make sure we're guiding people and being really clear with people. And actually what happens when you make a start is that people want that, because uncertainty is worse than knowing what to do. Even though we don't want to face this in lots of ways, we just would like to think that everybody's doing the best they can for children, because most people are. But unfortunately, we know that whenever people are in a position of trust, whenever there's that power dynamic, there is a risk. And unless we're managing that risk, we've got our heads in the sand and we're pretending it isn't happening. And that's what we need to not do. So access the resources that have been shared. It's all there, within that Sport New Zealand page and our page, to help you put in place what you need to put in place. And none of it is just a piece of paperwork that you can take and then apply. It is a journey, it is a process, but also you can go back to Sport NZ and you can come back to us. It's not a one-stop shop. You can bounce back to those resources and get further guidance as you step through that journey. But back to the first point, that just make a start, go to those resources, see what you can apply straight away, and have those conversations in your clubs and organisations about what changes you might need to make to some of those things, and then just keep moving along the journey one step at a time, and don't think that any one person is responsible for it, because actually everybody is responsible for safeguarding and child protection. That's parents, your youth coaches, your more senior coaches, right the way up through your layers of the organisation. Yeah,
Ruth, that's a great point that relates to an awesome question that's been put in the chat, and I know you've actually been busy writing answers in the chat while we had Joe speaking, so thanks for that.
Tap away.
We have had one come through from Ian. We tend to use a lot of senior students as managers of specific sports teams within our school. They have significant contact with our student athletes. Would you recommend safeguarding training for them as well as the coaches?
Absolutely, yeah. So something we've been working on recently is that the Sport NZ e-learning is appropriate for all age groups of coaches. However, we had it raised to us, and we tend to agree that doing an online e-learning module on their own at home, the content might be quite triggering for younger coaches, and to make sure that we're supporting our youth when we're delivering that kind of information to them, that they've got an adult that knows they're doing that training, that can debrief with them. And also we're looking at developing training specifically for younger coaches, where the content is softer and maybe less confronting. So I think for 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, that content is fine. Any younger than that, we need to be looking at another way of getting those messages across. But they do need to be trained, and they actually carry a specific contextual risk, those youth coaches, those youth leaders, because they've come up through the ranks themselves, and they'll consider themselves as peers, and they won't necessarily know that they're in a position of trust or what that means. And that's why it's really important that they get some of the training and that they get some assistance in moving into that role. So the code of conduct is really good for, really important for those youth coaches and youth leaders, guiding them when you're moving into that more responsible position. How do you manage that?
Awesome. Another question that's come through. This is just a theoretical question. If it is another child or athlete that may be at risk to a child, is the response similar? Would it be in a policy?
It's similar, but not the same, because they're not in a position of trust. So the power dynamic isn't there, and you haven't got your responsibility, your duty of care, that you are engaging a person, and then you've got a responsibility to make sure that person's behaving in line with your club's expectations. But with another young person that's a risk, that is still a risk that's happening within your context. So it's a similar response, but slightly different, because you're not holding them to an organisational code of conduct for someone that you've engaged as like a staff or volunteer, but they're a club member. So you could have codes of conduct for club members. I know I was talking with a rugby organisation recently, and they have a code of conduct, like a really simplified one for their athletes, or, you know, for their sports participants, and it's about sideline behaviour and that sort of stuff. So if you've got another young person who's behaving in a way that is outside of your expectations behaviourally or is a risk, then it needs to be addressed, but it's a slightly different response.
That's awesome. And we've had another question come through from Alejo, which is really asking around, does Sport NZ have a package to help sports clubs becoming safe organisations and compliant with the Child Protection Act 2014 to support with funding and assist with policy making and, more important, implementation and monitoring of the policy? So great question, Alejo, and I might just try and jump in and help answer that from a Sport NZ perspective. There are a handful or great resources on the Integrity portal. I'd really encourage you to go there. There's a community guidance portal, there's policies and procedures, there's education and training, and there's a link through to the Independent Sport and Recreation Complaints Mechanism that is a really important starting point for all organisations to go through. So in terms of a package for community clubs and organisations that are relevant to them, it's a great starting point. And as this program develops and we start to produce more resources and support for different layers of organisations, we'll continue to update that through our website and through other channels that we operate in. There are a few other questions. I'm just going to have a look for one more to throw out there before we jump off. Oh, there was one that jumped out at me. So from Grant, with the disruption, this is aimed at you, Ruth, if possible, with the disruption of COVID and especially level 4 in Auckland, how do we keep parents, sports clubs, etc., keeping up with appropriate levels of engagement and comms within teams when a child may already have been online all day? How do we manage this appropriately? So something around the online environment. Is there any recommendations on that process?
I mean, I wouldn't know how you're going to engage in terms of keeping people active in sport online. That's outside of my ideas. But in terms of risk to children in online environments, you've got another context there, haven't you, with how you're communicating. So just trying to think of specific advice around that online environment. Just making sure that you're sticking again within a kind of code of expectations, a code of conduct. So you haven't got individual people contacting individual children, that the organisation sets how you're going to do that. Does that?
It does, yeah, it does. And we do have a sort of one pager, an online do's and don'ts that I guess takes a little bit of the child safeguarding and protection recommendations and it applies it slightly more to a sporting context for organisations that may be delivering more online sessions in replacement of regular activity. So again, I'd really recommend people checking that out. That sort of shows what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, as a bit of a guideline for organisations and clubs and teams and coaches to follow, so that there is a safe environment for all. I think that's a really good place to wrap it up. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Ruth, for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. I'm sure everyone on the call has been able to pick up some absolute gold. And to everyone on the call, thank you for tuning in and contributing to the conversation. As we move into the summer sports season, we hope we've added a little bit to your kete and are now thinking of ways that can make the best season and best environment for the rangatahi that you are involved with and supporting. If you do want to find out more about Balance is Better, I would encourage you to have a look around the Balance is Better website and sign up to receive the e-newsletter, and also a massive a push towards the integrity portal on the Sport NZ website. Again, thank you to Ruth for sharing your in-depth knowledge, and for Joe to being so open about the experiences that you and your organisation have been through. I would just like to finish with the karakia to finish up tonight's session. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tauai te mauri tū, kia tauai te mauri ora, tū tura whakamaua, kia tina, homie, huie, tai kia.